Good morning, everyone. Thank you, and welcome to the session on what's next for ODA in Alberta and Canada. I'm Leah Etter. I'm the Executive Director at ACGC. And today I'm pleased also to be joined with Erica from CCIC. She'll be introduced in a moment. Today we're hoping to share with everyone some of the developments over the summer related to both Alberta and across Canada on some upcoming advocacy opportunities. But to start that, to start that conversation, we wanted to share with you some research that ACGC has done over the summer in relation to the cuts to international aid from the provincial government. So before sharing the PowerPoint, I do, for those who are less aware of it, for 45 years, the Government of Alberta has invested in international development through providing small grants to small, medium organizations in Alberta. And out of the provincial government that was elected last May, when the new budget rolled out in October 2019, this program was suddenly cut. There was no notice of it. Even the department to which would distribute the funding had no awareness that this would happen. And many of the organizations, of course, that are on this call or listening to this recording were beneficiaries of this program. So subsequent to that, of course, COVID hit a few months later, and so we're in a situation where funding was cut to that, and of course, it's going to be difficult in this current fiscal reality to advocate to get that back. So in this context, and over the summer, ACGC requested through Freedom of Information request to the provincial government and received the documentation, historical documentation of this program to be able to just do an analysis. This hadn't been done in the past publicly, of the money that was spent, which organizations it went to, and what kind of which organizations went to, which countries it went to, and so we were able to publish that. We're releasing it today. So I'm going to share with you some of the findings of this report, and I'll get this all when I'm link is on our website that you can download. But and some of the limitations and what we did research and what we didn't have time yet to research. So let me just hold on one moment as I bring up the slides. So I believe you can see my screen. Okay. Great. So throughout this presentation, I'll just call it the International Development Program from Alberta. It was under different ministries throughout the 45 years. Most recently, most of us would know it as CIP, Community Initiatives Program. That was the last 10 years. Before that, the Wild Rose Foundation was sort of responsible for distributing that grant program. And prior to that, the records don't quite show, it just says it came from general budget in the very early years. So, but for the sake of this presentation, we'll call it the International Development Program. For that. So let me just move that. So the analysis that we did aimed to provide insight into 4 key areas of this program. So we wanted to look at the annual budgets and expenditure over the 45 years to see what they actually were and what was spent. And we did receive that information through the FOIP request. The number and location of Alberta organizations which received the funding. So, with ACGC, our membership is quite small compared to the number of organizations that annually would receive the funding. So we wanted to take a look at how many organizations small, medium organizations are operating in Alberta, and that were supported through this fund. We also wanted to take a look at the types of international development projects supported with the funding, and just to see where some of the priorities lie, where did the money, what was it spent on, what was the Alberta government investing in, if we put it that way, and then the countries and regions impacted by the contribution of Albertans. So some key program data that we were able to obtain showed that over 45 years there were close to 7,000, so 6,892 international assistance projects were funded in at least 85 countries, and a total expenditure of $117 million. Well, and some keynotes to remember about the fund is that there was a maximum of, in the later years, a maximum of $25,000 a year that an organization could obtain, and the organization was required to match that dollar for dollar. So when we're talking about mobilizing private donations, what organizations would have to report is how much towards this. They got $25,000 from the Alberta government. How much private donations from Albertans did they collect towards this similar project? So that was a requirement of the fund to access the fund. And so you'll see that it wasn't dollar for dollar. In fact, as Albertans donated almost fivefold the amount of money in a match. So it was quite effective in that way. Some other things you'll find in the report are about budget versus expenditure. So it was very curious to see that while there were certain budgets set, how much was actually distributed fluctuated significantly. And interestingly, in the early 80s, you will see that at one point, I believe it was 1983-84 year, the expenditure, the amount given out was almost $2.5 million more than actually the government had budgeted. That came crashing down mid-80s, as you see, and it's quite flat for the last 20 years. You'll find in the report some information about the latest fluctuations, some which of us in our sort of current knowledge will remember. It was cut, the program was cut in 2004 and 5, related to an audit that the government was doing. It was put on hold in 2013. In 14, the program was cut, but then through advocacy, through ACGC and the organization, some of you will remember postcard campaigns and mobilization, the fund got reinstated, but only about half of what it was before, about $650,000. And then in 2016, there was a change in government in 2015, and in 2016, the government reinstated the previous full amount of the average being $1.5 million a year from about, you'll see, about 1994 onwards. So that amount sort of was reinstated in the last few years. One interesting thing we found in the FOIP data was that the last 2 years of the program, so 2017-18, 2018-19, it shows on record that the expenditure wasn't put out, that there was a bigger budget, but organizations didn't use it. And I'm not saying that this was justification for cutting it, but there were constraints that aren't mentioned in the government documents that because of the cap on funding of $25,000, organizations who could have accessed that 1.5 million that was sitting there were obstructed to do so because of the cap of the program. So there were some flaws with the way the program was run in the last few years, which should be considered when thinking that it should, when the records show that organizations were unresponsive. It wasn't that organizations were unresponsive. There was certainly capacity to use that funding, but they were constrained to do so. So that's reflected in their report as well. Some interesting things. So we looked at the overarching, the 45 years, but some limitations to that is that the detailed records were destroyed for the first 25 years because there isn't an obligation to continue to hold those. So with that, we weren't able to go back 45 years to find out which countries, what were the projects, which were the type of organizations. The last 10 years, however, so we do have some of that on file that they provided, but the last 10 years at least of the funding is all available online and very detailed records. So what we decided to do was do sort of a focus of the last 10 years, looking at different types of data available. So not just expenditures, but some more nuanced data. And so we looked at the organizations funded, we looked at the types of projects, and we looked at the countries and regions, because that is available for the last 10 years on the Government of Alberta website. So some of the types of the organizations funded, we found that in the last 10 years of the program, there were 218 unique Alberta organizations that were funded in 44 communities across the province. That's significant. That's a lot of organizations, and you'll see the spread of those on this map. The majority being, of course, within Alberta, because that was a condition. What we did find were 2 that were listed as national, one being the Canadian Red Cross when emergency aid was provided to international disaster relief, so that is one. And the other national one that's listed in the last 10 years is SEBA Canada. We're not sure why they would be funded if they weren't Alberta based, but the records do show at one point they were listed as Edmonton. So perhaps there was a change in a headquarter location or something, or they re-registered as a national organization, not Alberta, but the Alberta government recognized that and continued to fund them. But they're listed in the records as being a national organization. But of the 218, you'll see the spread: 63 in Edmonton, 71 in Calgary, but the majority of the rest are across other communities and rural areas of the province. Some interesting things of note: a significant number of those, and if you just hold on for me for a minute as I flip, 59 of the 218 organizations are individual Rotary clubs, and those Rotary clubs, the majority of those, 34 of the 59 were in rural communities. So when we're looking at the impact of this cut, the significance of the Rotary clubs in mobilizing communities, especially rural communities, is a significant issue to be addressed, and they will be impacted significantly as well as rural Albertans. Some of the types of projects, what we did was look at we coded all of the projects related to how the OECD codes projects for international reporting. And so in the last decade, we talked about, there were over 6,800 projects in total over 45 years. Well, the last decade, there were 709 projects. Of those 709, 38% focused on education, 18% on health, and 15% on basic social services. And then because of ACGC and the current federal government and our focus on women and girls, we wanted to take a look about how many of those were specific to our gender equality projects. And where we could identify in the project descriptions that they were for women and girls, that we tagged them as a gender equality project, and 10% of those, of the 709 projects, were specific to gender equality and the rights of women and girls. That number is probably higher. It was just we were restricted to the descriptions provided, but that is interesting to see that 10% in the last decade were very specific to women and girls. Together in that last decade, just for expenditure wise, when we're thinking of the $117 million over 45 years, the last 10 years was $11 million. So the last 10 years was the lower portion, but you remember from the graph before that the 7, 8, 9 million a year in the early 80s has skewed that. So here's a basic breakdown of the types of projects you will see, and in the report you'll find the detailed data of the number of projects and the expenditure on each of those areas. But these are specific areas that were funded. Other social services was a big area, and this is not quite a catch-all, but sort of, so a lot of basic level of social services would be in here. There were things, a significant amount of money going to supporting orphans and vulnerable children with basic needs. basic nutrition, basic housing, basic clothing, these very basic interventions, holistic interventions, those are classed as other social services. So a significant portion of the other social services were to orphan and vulnerable children. So and one other thing to note in education, there was a percentage of it was particular to Rotary clubs doing playgrounds and early childhood education. Construction of playgrounds and those types of things are listed under education for early childhood education. But those are the breakdowns. Regions and countries of focus, the regions receiving, so one other note is that data on which country the funds were going to wasn't started to record it in the government data until 2013. So we couldn't do the last 10 years, but so this is a capture of those last 6 years of data available. So in those 2013 to 19, when we can see which countries this money was going to, there were 424 projects. And you'll see that the majority of the types of countries here, so Eastern Africa, Southern Asia, Central America. And then of the 85 countries, again, from 2013 to 2019, you'll see that India, Ethiopia, Malawi, Peru, and Pakistan, these are the number of projects. So again, here's a map. You'll find that in there in relation to. Now, a good thing to note for those who are not as familiar with the program, we shouldn't interpret this as strategic decisions by the government of Alberta towards specific regions. They would answer requests of organizations. So we noticed in the data specifically that there was no if an organization said, this is what I want to do, the government was less focused on the project or the specific country and saying yes or no to specific countries. It was more about, oh, you're an Alberta organization, you're in this community, we want to fund you. And when the funding did drop, and I didn't get into this in this presentation, but when the funding did drop in the last few years, for example, in 2016-17, the number of organizations funded remained stable. So it's clear that when the funding dropped, they didn't fund less organizations. They tried to fund as many of the same organizations as possible, but gave them less money towards their projects. So there was interesting to see how the decision making was more about supporting Albertans and what they fundamentally believe is right to do and the initiatives and the relationships they have, rather than a strategic decision about which countries are we investing in, which types of projects we are investing in. And a quick last bit before I pass to Erica, and then she can talk about sort of the national context. Comparison to federal funding. We did a quick analysis. We didn't have the time to do deep analysis, but comparison in the same last 10 years, the federal government, you'll see, provided funding to 2,300 international development projects, removing multilateral, compared to Alberta's 709. The federal government funded 596 organizations. Alberta had funded 218. And you'll see the comparison there in the funding. But what's interesting, of course, from the Alberta perspective is of the 596 organizations the federal government funded, only 20 of those are Alberta, in the last 10 years, are Alberta organizations. And a further breakdown on that, of the 20 organizations, only 10 are civil society organizations. So the government of Alberta funding would only go to civil society organizations. So when we're trying to compare apples to apples, we think of the 10 civil society organizations which got funded federally over the last 10 years versus the 218 that got funded provincially. We can note that it isn't an easy say to, oh, you've lost Alberta funding, so go get funding from the federal government. It simply doesn't work. And you'll see that even of the funding from the federal government, 3 private sector organizations received $264 million over the last 10 years from the federal government. So it is really, there's a lot more federal funding going obviously outside to other Albertans outside, other organizations outside Alberta, but even within Alberta going to private sector, not through civil society. And there's a breakdown. So if we look at just civil society money, government money provided to civil society in the last 10 years, $62 million, but 10 organizations shared the amount from the federal government, where 218 from the provincial government. And of those organizations federally, only seven of those qualified for the Alberta fund as well. So some quick conclusions on that. So for 45 years, the Alberta government demonstrated significant leadership in supporting health, social, and economic conditions. While the dollar value of the international program in the last decade was small in compared to the provincial budget from the Alberta government, the fund encouraged a positive Alberta presence internationally and represented a long-standing public commitment of our resource-rich province to support, and this is a quote from the government, the CIP program, Albertans' concern for social justice and a desire to help those less fortunate around the world. Some of the kind of key takeaways, some of these are in the report and some are just specifically for today, but the fund was instrumental, as we see, in mobilizing a large number of Alberta communities and organizations to take meaningful and concrete action as global citizens. So 40 organizations were in 44 different communities, and that's significant because that is not replaceable from funding and support from the federal government. The fund was especially important in mobilizing Albertans in rural areas, as well as small community-based organizations, again, which federal funding has not achieved. Very little federal government project-based funding flows to Alberta civil society organizations for international AIDS projects. So this program should not be considered a replacement or alternative to the Alberta International Development Program. They are very different and have different modes of operation. And what's interesting as a further note, a takeaway, is that the Alberta International Development Program Fund mobilized more in private donations from Albertans than the federal government contributed to Albertan organizations. So through providing $1.5 million a year to Albertan organizations, Albertans were, in the last decade, gave $73 million to international aid, where the federal government only gave $51 million to aid. So we can see that these small community-based funds are instrumental in mobilizing Albertans in public engagement, but also mobilizing Albertans to donate and to match. So it is a loss, a significant loss, when you think of it this way, that the impact of especially of the private donations is where we're going to see a lot of hurt. And then, so given the number of Albertan organizations and communities which access the International Development Program and the amount of matching private donations, Albertans demonstrate a clear desire to assist global communities in realizing their own human rights, dignity, and prosperity. And you know, as note for today, especially a takeaway, especially in light of COVID-19, the Alberta government should reinstate this fund immediately in order to mobilize Albertans to respond to urgent global needs. We see it was very effective in mobilizing Albertans to donate, and in light of COVID-19, this small investment of $1.5 million over the provincial budget will go a long way in supporting global communities. So that's basically what I have for now. I mean, the report is online. I'm going to stop share. The report is online. When Erica starts, I will put the link in for you to download, and we'll take questions in a little bit, but I encourage you to take it. It's quite a short report, and it's very data heavy, but we're pleased to be able to have gotten the data from the provincial government and now provide it publicly for everybody to take a look at. So thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Just to remind you all, if you have comments and questions, to type them in the chat, and then we'll get to them after Erica's presentation. So I'll invite Erica to come on. Erica is the ODA campaign coordinator at CCIC, the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. In this role, she is supporting the sector in advocating for increased Canadian investments in international development and humanitarian initiatives. Previously, in her role at Civicus, she supported the work of global civil society coalitions, and as the Community Engagement Manager at Results Canada, she worked on public advocacy campaigns that influenced Canada's international development spending and policies. Erica is passionate about using her voice and empowering others to use their voices to create change. Erica, thank you for joining us. Please unmute and start.
Okay, thanks, Rumi, and thanks so much to ACGC for setting this up, and I think giving this symposium a really important framing around unlearning and relearning, and thanks for having me. So yeah, my name is Erica Richter. I'm from the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. For those of you who don't know us, just quickly, we are the National Association of International Development and Humanitarian Organizations across Canada. So we have over 90 members from coast to coast to coast, covering very small organizations to medium organizations to some of the large INGOs in the country. And you'll hear a bit today about some of the ways that we support members and work with members, and happy to chat on the side if you have other questions about our organization and how we work. But thanks, Leah, for sharing that presentation. And I think from what you shared so far, it seems like you have a great base of evidence to support your potential advocacy work in Alberta. So excited to talk more about that and hear more from others on the call about your interest in advocating around this. Today, I'll just give you a sense of what we've been doing at the national level around advocating for more and increased investments in official development assistance. So I'll talk a little bit about the context that we're in and our sort of assessment of the need to advocate and the need to take action around this. And I'll give you a bit of an idea of what we've done so far. So we'll just be able to skim the surface with this short presentation, but I'll give you a sense of what we've been working on, and then talk a little bit more about what you can do, and specifically the role of Albertan organizations and Albertans in this work. And then keen to talk to you more about that afterwards as well. So just to start off, in terms of context, obviously Alberta has experienced cuts, and fortunately that's a trend at the national level as well. So we know that Canadian international assistance has been decreasing as a percentage of our national income for a decade. And we have a difficult and challenging context globally. We have less than 10 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Targets. We have an increasing needs and challenges that have resulted from COVID-19. We have climate change that's impacting and exacerbating development and humanitarian issues around the world. And ultimately, Canada doesn't have enough money in its budget to do its fair share and meet our obligations to the world. So on top of that challenging sort of environment and external context, we have a Conservative Party that proposed cutting international assistance funding by 1/3 during last year's election. That's a major national party that's, of course, well represented in Alberta, suggesting that we should withdraw from the world and contribute far less around the world. This party will one day form government again, and they believe that that was a successful policy proposal. So there's a huge risk and threat there that needs to be addressed, not only to advocate for an increase, but also just to defend the international assistance funds that we have. So it became clear from all of that there was a need for us to get organized and sort of support the sector around a campaign. And so that's what we did. And in doing so, we looked at sort of what our approach had been in the past, because we knew it wasn't working. And so we knew that traditionally we've been asking for 0.7% of GNI, which is sort of the historical marker set by Lester B. Pearson. And that wasn't really resonating. It wasn't resonating with decision makers. And we care deeply about our work, and we believe it's the morally right thing to do. But we expected government to feel the same way. We expect them to also perceive this to be the morally right thing to do. And that isn't always the case. And that was posing a challenge to our success. And we were also uncoordinated. So it was sort of the 1,000 flowers bloom approach. We were all doing bits and pieces of work. We were meeting with members of parliament, going on Twitter and posting about advocacy issues, but we weren't talking to each other. We weren't aligned. We weren't coordinated in our efforts. So that was sort of the landscape and some of the challenges that we were facing. So in terms of what we've done so far, we did do some landscape mapping work, and we put together a strategy, and I'll give you a bit of a sense of some of the elements of that strategy, just because I think it is relevant in both a provincial and national context, many of these sort of principles or ways that we're going about this work. So there's sort of three main components to the work. The first is an insider stream. And the reality is that we did a mapping of sort of who we need to influence, whose perspectives we need to change in order to see an increase to official development assistance. And the number of people is actually very few. So this stream of work is really about reaching that small group of key decision makers with a politically compelling, pragmatic case for investing in international assistance. So we want to show them how this is also a win for government, how we can backstop them against risk, and show that Canadians are supportive of this decision, supportive of international investment, supportive of Canada doing its fair share. And a key part of this work is engaging with the Conservative Party of Canada and Conservative decision makers. And then there's also the sort of what we've called the outsider stream of work. This is just the language we use, but I think we could probably find better words. And that's about mobilizing Canadians who aren't already supporters or active supporters in key demographics that are essential to electoral success. So in spaces where we know the political parties are looking to win votes, we want to show that those people support these investments and are prioritizing them in their voting. And then also more broadly engage and show the impact of Canadian international assistance as part of that stream of work as well. And then the third piece is also just about building our capacity to work together as a sector, to collaborate effectively, to overcome internal incentives for the sake of the greater good and the collective impact. So some of the things that we've been doing, we've been meeting weekly for some and monthly for others as a group to talk through how we can align our efforts, what we've been up to, sharing intel, sharing what we've heard. And we developed an ask together around a COVID response. So our ask was for Canada to invest 1% of its COVID response globally, and also to double ODA over the next 5 years. And so with that ask, we've shared it with the Prime Minister through letters, as well as other key decision makers. We had a day of action on social media where we were trending on Twitter. We've had meetings, we've done countless sort of forms of outreach and coordinated that outreach among us. And what we've seen so far is that it's been working. I think a key part of this is that when we collaborate together, we have a much greater impact and much greater influence. And so we're really excited to hear in the throne speech this week a mention of investing more in international assistance and of prioritizing a global COVID response. And also just today, we heard Prime Minister Trudeau announce a $440 million investment in COVAX, $220 million of which will be going to ensure that the most marginalized and vulnerable around the world have access to a COVID vaccine when it's ready. And that funding is going to be new and additional from our current international assistance envelope. So these are already a couple of initial successes that we've had. We're obviously a long way to doubling ODA, but I think there's been some key lessons here around making a politically smart and pragmatic case to those few decision makers that truly have influence, working with Canadians and mobilizing Canadian support for international assistance, and then collaborating and working together effectively to work towards our collective ask. So what can you do, and what's the role of Alberta in all of this? So I've already mentioned the importance of engaging with Conservatives, and I really want to emphasize the important role that you all can play in this work, particularly given Alberta's influence with the Conservative Party. You have really an outsized opportunity to influence. Understanding this is obviously a deeply difficult moment in Alberta, as it is across Canada for many reasons, but there's a lot of power in seeing citizens engage, show support, and also directly engaging with decision makers. And I know that already during the symposium, ACGC has been facilitating that outreach as well, which is excellent. And I think there's lots of opportunities to both at the national and provincial level have influence by going to talk to your members of parliament and your decision makers provincially. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that CCIC has taken the better part of a year to develop investment cases. So these are both, there's a case that outlines why Canada should be investing in official development assistance, that includes some of the impacts that official development assistance from Canada has had around the world, as well as other returns and important principles for why we should be investing. And that has been developed in collaboration with our membership, and also is supported by 11 thematic cases that outline the rationale for investing in particular subsectors. So what is the impact of investing in education? What's the impact of investing in nutrition, in WASH, in governance, in gender equality? So we have 4-page cases for 11 different subsector areas that sort of give a really strong policy and evidence base for our advocacy work. And so we're happy to share those. I think there's lots of opportunities for them to be adapted to fit into a provincial context, and or they could be used within Alberta to advocate at the national level. But definitely happy to circulate those and talk more about how they could be used. So I'm going to wrap up there. I'm looking forward to the discussion and conversation and seeing how we can collaborate to advocate for more of this important work.
Thank you, Erica, and thanks again, Leah, for those 2 presentations.